How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 235 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode is actually the first week that I've recorded for a good few weeks because I'm just back from a little holiday, and yeah, it's weather-wise, it's still along the same lines as it was before we went. So we left on the 29th, we came back on the 10th, and yeah, we'd wet and grey days on both ends of that. So while leaving and definitely when we came home, the day we came home, it was like for all the world, it was like a day in October. It had that kind of chilly feel to it, wind and a bit of rain. And it's always really interesting coming back. Sometimes, remember a couple of years ago, I, did an episode on sort of my gardening thoughts from Italy that time. This time it's not along those lines, but it's interesting to see after coming back from holidays the changes, or in some cases the lack of change since leaving. It's the first time I've gone away that I've noticed that growth, has been there, but it hasn't, the place hasn't been overrun while I was away. Um, the tomatoes in the tunnel have grown a nice bit. There was a good bit of stringing up and side shooting to do, but they're not very far on since then. And it really is a feature of this summer, similar to last summer. A feature is that there has been lower than normal temperatures. I know, yeah, the reports in the papers and all of that say it's the warmest month and so on, but certainly daytime temperatures are not what we expect for summertime. And the biggest thing, and I'm going to delve a bit further into this, not today, but I'm going to sort of have a look and try and get some actual data on this. Light levels are still extremely poor. They've been poor all spring. And I know there's a world of theories out there as to why this is, and I'm not going to comment on them at the moment because I don't have any information to hand. I don't know enough about it. But without a doubt, we are not seeing light levels like we should be seeing. Last summer was, that feature was there, and this spring, we were talking about sowing seeds earlier in the spring, and the light levels are just not there. And I'm seeing that again, evidence of that with in terms of tomatoes and the plants that like that sun or that need that sun, and fruit, for example. So fruit, out since I came back, my raspberries, there's a lot of ripe raspberries on them. Actually no kind of good sweet taste in it because they're not getting that sun. They're not sun kissed, for want of a better word. They are, there's light levels, but there is no sun, and it's definitely something I'm going to sort of look into a little bit more. I've been looking at kind of weather and weather trends a bit, and I want to kind of get, I suppose, a more detailed look at the light levels because I know that is something that's measured as well. And it's 100% a feature, and it's affecting growth in a big way because, as I say, it's the first time that I've come back that it's been very noticeable that the lawn needed cutting, but nowhere near as badly as other times. Now, I was away for a slightly shorter period of time, but not much. And, just generally growth is poor. Um, so I suppose I kind of do a run through the garden, um, as to what has been happening, how things are going, some really good successes on certain things, and some things that are struggling. And yeah, that's kind of going to be the theme of this week's episode. It's interesting as well to hear what the rest of you are struggling with, and I've got some emails when I'm away. We'll chat about them at the end. Actually, there's a few reasons I want to talk about that, and it's the same thing that most people are seeing. So I'll sort of virtually run through, both the polytunnel and the garden outside, and chat about what is has been going well, what's struggling, what I am struggling with, and so on. So we'll start in the polytunnel, and as I said, reasonable growth on tomatoes while I was away, but we're still quite a bit away from from having ripe fruit at this stage, and that's definitely something I noticed. Now I obviously been away. I give them a good feed when I was going with seaweed, and when I got back, I give them straight away. I give them a good feed again. Obviously, you know, doing all the removing the side shoots, stringing them up a bit better, and I've been doing that, and growth has been good. But as I say, still I would say 3 to 4 weeks away from having ripe tomatoes, and that's a long ways behind last year. Certainly, the colder spring meant that things just sat for a little while. Um, but I think a big part of it is the sunlight levels that I'm talking about. But from your perspective at home, just to give you a few tips around those, it's hugely important to keep feeding. So feed your tomatoes on a regular basis, at this time of the year. Deadheading or not deadheading, removing side shoots and lower leaves is important as well. Keeping the area really clean, opening tunnels, opening doors, getting air movement through that, especially on warm, clammy days. Getting air movement through the tunnel is good in terms of disease prevention. But in terms of, getting these to fruiting stage and to continue them fruiting up into later into the year, they're going to need a good bit of feeding at this time of the year. So the more help you can give them, the better. Light levels hopefully will improve. Today is a good sunny day here, and that will, help speed things up. So tomatoes have been growing well, but still a little bit away from having, harvestable crops there. Things like peppers in my polytunnel, and again, I know I mentioned it a good bit, but my polytunnel is quite a bit cooler. So peppers still a long ways away from having, peppers on that. Chilies maybe a little bit earlier. So they're coming along okay, but not wonderfully. I have cucumbers. They're kind of almost ready to go. So that has been, reasonably good. And then obviously all the usual salads still coming from the tunnels. I still have lettuce, mixed leaves, radishes, spring onions, and one of the biggest wins has been garlic from the polytunnel and onions from the polytunnel. So planted them from sets and from cloves of garlic last October, and they've been hugely successful. So the garlic was particularly good, really big, strong, healthy, clean, really clean bulbs. And they're harvested now, initially just harvested and dropped onto the ground, allowed them to dry out a little bit for the first few days, and then I've moved them up onto a bench since and continuing the drying process. They'll get turned a couple of times. They'll be fully dry within a couple of weeks, and then I'll just string them up inside in the shed in I suppose a dark area that's quite cool. And all going well, then what I'd be looking at is adding to the harvest, which will come from outside. I'll be doing that this week, doing the same process of drying those out, and we'll be looking at potentially, so I'm using them fresh now. The last of last year's ones I would have finished probably a month ago, 5 weeks ago. And so we're looking at, garlic pretty much right through till next year's harvest. And that's, I suppose, what you'd love to be having with a lot of the crops. I'll be able to do it no problem with garlic this year. I'll get a long ways through with onions. So yeah, that's kind of one of the successes. The tunnel grown onions and garlic have been really, really successful. On the garlic, absolutely no disease whatsoever on them in the tunnel. So I think that's something that, a lot of people are struggling with outside. A lot of people have rust issues on their garlic. And typically when you get rust, it means at that stage that your garlic is not going to get much, if any, bigger. And it kind of means that whatever stage they're at, that's it. You're not going to get any further with them. So the fact that they're so clean in the tunnel has made them that you're getting a really good size, head of garlic, bulb of garlic, and as I say, spotlessly clean. I don't do too much shaking off of clay or anything like that. I just pull them, let them dry, and then when they're going inside, if there's any like loose clay, obviously I'll take it off, not to have it falling on the floor of the shed. But generally speaking, I don't do much cleaning on them at all. I just hang them up as they have dried. So that's been a really, really big success. Courgettes, I'm sort of running myself virtually around the tunnel here. Courgettes are growing really well. I have some harvest there, smaller ones at this stage, but yeah, there is some harvest there. Herbs all still doing well, harvesting all of those. And then I have dwarf French beans, which I'm harvesting now. And I have some climber beans, and they're doing well, but they're not ready for harvest yet. So they're flying, or they have flown up since I went away. Squashes are doing really well. A little bit away from having anything there, but they're flying along, so that's good. And beds of I have a bed with basil in it, with lettuce in it. It has actually a bit of a mix of flowers in it as well, sunflowers and marigolds and so on. And that's, there's a nice harvest coming out of that. I'm hoping the tomatoes catch up so that we'll have basil and tomato together. Strawberries have been phenomenal from the tunnel. The strawberry crowns are this will be their fourth season. So definitely this year there was, in terms of size of the actual strawberry, they were quite a bit smaller. But in terms of taste, they've been just beautiful. Really, really sweet. Normally I'd be taking strawberry crowns out after the fourth year. But I'm actually thinking, because these were still quite good, I'm going to leave them for one more year. They are still, as I say, producing a smaller fruit, but the taste has been phenomenal. So I'm going to keep them going for another bit. I will plant in some new ones just to have, a freshness coming. I'll harvest the runners at this, in a month's time or so, 2 months' time, and I'll plant those in, and that'll give me that, fresh crop for next year as well. So, yeah, that's the strawberries. What else have I in there? Um, yeah, I think sweet corn is flying up, absolutely flying. All of those got planted just before I went. Yeah, all of those are doing really well. Outside then, I have potatoes that were started in large pots in the polytunnel are now lifted outside, British Queen's variety, and I've started harvesting those. First harvest was quite small, but I knew that would be the case. But absolutely delicious, so good. And that has been something that I've noticed. The potatoes that we're getting generally at the moment, the shop bought ones are not that good, not that tasty either. So it was really nice the other day to start getting into them. Even though they were small, there was a lot of them eaten, and they were absolutely delicious. So keeping an eye on them. The reason I have them out of the tunnel is because the tomatoes are in there now. I don't want to have tomatoes and potatoes in the same place. Want to try and, particularly with blight, I want to ensure that don't have any issue there. But I'll definitely harvest any of those, once I see any sign of blight on them. And while they might be small, they'll still be very, very tasty. So happy with those. Rhubarb, which is into its second year now. So they were planted as crowns last year, didn't harvest at all off them. I have started harvesting small amounts now, and they're doing extremely well. So looking forward to, some rhubarb towards the back end of this year, but mainly going into next year. They're going to be fully fledged, big, strong crowns now, and we'll be able to harvest away off those. Outdoor garlic is ready to go, so that's a hardneck variety there. Haven't produced as big a bulb as last year, but they generally don't produce a big bulb anyway. So forget the variety, but it's a lovely pink variety, really strong and pungent. So they have done really well, and again they'll get harvested and dried off. Onions have done really well. They were sown ones, and they're ready for harvest now as well. So that's another really good harvest outside. Um, Broccoli or Calabrese, harvesting off that at the moment. Really good harvest, really clean actually, which is very surprising because I planted them before going on holidays. They were quite strong going in, a couple of weeks before going on holidays. They're quite strong going in, and they have done extremely well. And I'm harvesting off it straight away here. Probably be able to harvest off it for another week or two. Cabbage, the same thing, doing really well. And the biggest thing has been that there has been absolutely no damage on those from, the caterpillars or from slugs, which has been brilliant. There's absolutely no damage, and they've been really successful. Thing about them is, though, as I've said before, particularly, they take up a lot of space, and it's only a kind of a small harvest. So I kind of pick and choose. Sometimes I'll have cabbage, sometimes I won't. I'm not trying to have continuity there necessarily all the time. So have some at the moment. Same goes for the calabrese, but the harvest has been really good. Then I've done a couple of sowings of carrots, and success hasn't been brilliant. So there is some germination, some good germination in certain parts, but there's other parts without any germination. And I think I have two problems. Number one, I think the temperatures generally just haven't been consistently high enough for germinating seeds really well outside. Secondly, we've had these sort of heavy deluges of rain, and that's causing some issues around, washing seed and moving seed a bit after being sown. So that's kind of two of the issues. The other thing that I'm finding a big problem, and I know that some others are struggling with it as well, I've mentioned it before, is blackbirds. I just have really, really, in the Nordic garden particularly, a lot of issues with blackbirds just rooting at the clay, or at the compost. And they're definitely, causing disruption on the top and knocking out some of those seedlings. So I'm going to have a sporadic patchy carrot crop, and the same for parsnips. But they are growing, and I will have some harvest there. So that's pretty good. I have a nice harvest of carrots actually out of the polytunnel at the moment. So they're early sown ones, an early variety, and they're, quite nice at the moment. They're relatively small, kind of the thickness of your big finger and a little bit longer. Decent carrots, and I get a little bit of time out of them. And hopefully by the time I'm finished them, I'll be able to start harvesting on the outdoor ones. And yeah, they're kind of all doing well. Fruit wise, the raspberries, as I said, they're fruiting really well, but you just love them to get a bit of sun so that they would sweeten up. They're nice, but they're not gorgeous. So I'd like to see a little bit of sun to sweeten those up. Apples, there's some nice apples. Now these are all young trees. They're all only planted into their second year. So some nice apples on those. But over time that'll increase and get better as we go along. But the trees themselves are doing well, and there is some nice fruit on them. So yeah, looking forward to those. Then up in the other raised beds that I have, I've put my potatoes, blight-free potatoes up there this year. And they are absolutely flying it. So potatoes, generally speaking, while they were late getting into the ground for most people, and commercially they were extremely late getting into the ground. Potatoes have been doing really well here. And there've been loads of moisture in the ground. Temperatures, while they haven't been really high for things like tomatoes and peppers and so on, they've been high enough, generally speaking, for potatoes to grow quite well. So I'm really happy with the potatoes at the moment. They're doing really well. I'll do the first harvest of them hopefully in a couple of weeks' time, probably middle of August or thereabouts. And that's a kind of a second early variety, and they're the blight-free ones again. I'm being quite vigilant around slugs there, and I'm not looking like I have any issues at the moment. So you remember me saying that it was a quick complete wipeout last year. It's not the case this year, so it's looking quite good at the moment. And then as soon as they come out, I'll be getting some leeks into the ground there, and some winter spring crops at that stage. So yeah, that's sort of what's growing here. Obviously this time of the year it's all about salads, and I've loads of them, so that's great. But I'd like to see the tomatoes hurrying up a little bit, because just seems and feels like it is later with the lack of temperature and the lack of sun. Elsewhere then in the garden, I suppose I've spoke several times in relation to the wildflower meadow, and that's one that has, I mentioned that initially I grew that for for that look, to reduce the size of the lawn, and to have that high color, floral type look in the lawn. And I'm certainly getting that at periods. The May wildflower meadow has been phenomenal, just beautiful, dominated by ragged robin oxeye daisies then following through after that, and just amazing colour in it. But again, as of last year, and there's still great colour in it today. But obviously it is starting to go over a bit. The wet weather and the wind and rain has, flattened it in certain points, and it doesn't look as vibrant as it would in May and up until sort of mid-June. But the big thing, and the thing that has, been the real, I suppose, I won't say unexpected benefit, but initially I saw it primarily to have this beautiful meadow in the front. And that was my main primary focus. That has since changed, and it's all now about I suppose, the ecosystem that it has become, and particularly the birds. Mentioned it last year, we got bullfinches in, they're back again. I hadn't seen them, since the meadow was cut back last year. They're back again, pair of bullfinches, and it's really nice to see the bird activity particularly on it. So obviously it's alive with insects, the usuals. Not seeing so many bees. Butterflies are definitely not out yet. That's again down to heat and sunshine. Just not a lot of butterflies yet here anyway. And bees, there's some, but not a massive amount. But generally insects, the meadow is alive with insects. But the bird activity is phenomenal. It is, if you looked out through it and kind of put your eye across the top of the meadow, you will just, everywhere there's birds in it. So loads of goldfinches, bullfinches, as I said, which are beautiful to see, and not always in this garden, so it's great to see those. But the meadow is just alive. You're looking at them jumping onto the top of a flower head, and the flower head, or the stem of the plant, bending down like a fishing rod, and they're just picking away at it, and it is phenomenal. The amount of activity in there is phenomenal. So that's something that hasn't been affected in a bad way by our weather, with lots of rain and less sunshine. And certainly, as I say, the benefit, the ecosystem that it has become is hugely satisfying to see that. And yeah, it's been phenomenal, and still is. It'll definitely get cut at some point in the coming months, and then it'll be not much to look at for a good while after that, but lots of bulbs going to go into it again. So a lot went into it last year. Camassias went into it last year. They were really nice, and I'm just going to add to that this year with more Camassias. Bluebells are phenomenal in it. The yellow rattle is starting to get going in it. And so, yeah, the meadow is evolving and changing, and it's become a phenomenal ecosystem, and that's something that I'm really, really happy with within the garden. Elsewhere in the garden, I have mentioned before that there were certain areas in the garden that I suppose my focus remained on the edible garden, because time-wise I was just wasn't getting the time to spend in other areas. But yeah, I've started to try and tame one or two of these, and tame is the right word. I have weeds nearly as tall as myself in one particular flower bed, and that needs to get, as I say, tamed and reclaimed, I suppose. So I'll keep you posted on that one. But it is literally, it's a mass with weeds. Some lovely plants in there, but you can hardly see them with the weeds. And it's a bit embarrassing, actually, someone running a garden podcast, and I have that sort of a struggle. But something had to give, I suppose, in terms of time-wise. I just didn't have all that time, so you need to focus somewhere, and we focused where we're getting the most benefit day to day, which is in the edible garden. So need to do better there in terms of getting it more manageable for next year, get it back clean and tidy, and then get mulching into that area, get a lot more plants into it, and let the plants sort of dominate out, and mean that next year there wouldn't be much weeding on a bed like that anyway. So that's kind of the aim. That's kind of the aim over the next couple of months, is to sort of tame all these areas. I've created a few new flower beds for various reasons. One around, the dog's house, basically. There's an area which was gone untidy. It was an area which needed something done with it. And I was creating a new flower bed around a patio area at the back. So created that and then continued on and did the one around the doghouse. And so that needs to be planted up now as well. So yeah, there's lots going on, but definitely growth has been slow, I suppose, or slower than other years this year. Over the next couple of weeks, so some really interesting guest interviews coming up. Um, some of them are not in the bag yet, so I might not mention them, but if they come to pass, which I believe they will, they're going to be really, really good and interesting for people. So yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to chat about this week in terms of the garden and in terms of gardening. The other thing I wanted to mention was while I was away, I've been kind of thinking a little bit recently about the podcast, the direction that the podcast goes, and I suppose where I see the podcast going into the future. And the reason the podcast was started was to help people in their own gardens. And I've mentioned this a few times. Sometimes, you're doing it as a podcast. I'm here. I'm in my recording space. I don't have huge contact with you guys, the listeners, and that's something that I really love when that happens. And I suppose, feeling a bit disconnected from you guys as an audience recently. And while I was away, I got some brilliant, messages from listeners of the podcast, and yeah, that was really nice to see. I, as I say, I've been questioning where the podcast goes over the next couple of years and directions and so on. So it's really good to get these messages from people who are listeners and how how the episodes have helped them. And there was one particular person who has had a huge success with a wildflower meadow off the back of listening to the episodes on wildflowers, and has begun gardening for the first time off the back of learning from all the episodes that come through. So that's really heartening to hear. And I have another one coming up, Siobhan, who's been gardening for a while, but has learned so much over the last year, she tells me, from the podcast, and has asked me a listener's question to answer, which will be covered in next week's episode. So on that, there's a few ways to try and, I suppose, increase the contact and I suppose, the interaction. Podcasts by their nature are, you're listening somewhere, you're listening when you're gardening, you're listening when you're driving, you're listening when you're out for your walk, or whatever the case may be. And I'm recording it somewhere on my own, and I'm talking to you directly. I am, giving you advice in your garden directly that you can benefit in your garden. But there's a sort of sometimes there can be a disconnect there in that I don't know all of you guys. I have, upwards of 1,000 people per week listening to this, and I probably have contact from a lot, but definitely not 1,000 people. So it'd be great to hear from you. And in that now, there's a way of doing that there's a thing called fan mail. If you go into your show notes, there's a message right at the top of there's a message right at the top of the show description. And if you click on that, you'll be able to send a message directly, and we can, start a conversation. You can ask a question in relation to your own garden. You can tell me what you like about the podcast, tell me what you'd like to see about it. And that'll help me form, how we continue the podcast, how I continue delivering advice to you that can help you in your own garden, because that has always been always been the aim of the podcast. And as I say, when I get messages from people saying that they didn't fully understand how to do X, Y, or Z, and then I cover it on an episode and it gives them the sort of the steps to do it. And that has been really heartening to see those messages while I was away. You can also review the podcast, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can leave a review of the podcast, give it a 5-star rating. All of those things help. They're great for me to see as well, because I know that what I'm doing is actually having the impact that I wanted to have. But also it helps more people find the podcast, so it helps everybody. And yeah, that's something, if you can at all, be sure to send me a message or leave a review, or anything like that. It's great to connect with people. So the Carlow Garden Festival that was mentioned on last week's episode, that's kicking off in the next weekend, actually, that's kicking off. And I haven't picked the ones that I'm going to yet, but there's certainly some fabulous speakers at that, and really worth going to. So yeah, anyone interested in that, you get your tickets on carlogardentrail.com. And yeah, that's definitely some fabulous speakers across all types of gardening there. Some free events within there as well. Some, as I said, top class paid speakers as well. So it's a really, really good event, and worth checking out. Next week's episode, as I say, will be one which is answering a listener's question, and it's it's an interesting question, and one that I know others will have queries on. So, as I say, a listener's question next week, and then some really good guest interviews coming up. But for now, that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.